I first introduced macros in an earlier training video titled Advanced Filter, and I did it because it was very helpful when it came to using that feature. And you can watch that training video. In fact, I strongly recommend that you do watch it, and I do go over some of the basics, so if you've already seen it, you probably have an idea of what we're going to be covering here because this is the formal training video on macros. Having said that, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, what is a macro? A macro is a quick, easy solution to cut down on repeating a task over and over and over again by recording it just once and then saving it as a macro. In fact, simply put, a macro is nothing more than just a bunch of recorded steps that you can quickly execute in a single click or using shortcut keys. So looking at my workbook here, I've got the title on each worksheet and I have a total of 5 worksheets. There's Arizona, here's California, New York, and so on. And what I want to do is I want to go ahead and format the titles of each worksheet, like come up here, make it red, change the font type, the size, underline it. And so I do it just once. I'm going to record those steps and save it as a macro. And then I can come over here on the next worksheet and use the shortcut keys to quickly execute all the formats that I applied to this title on the first worksheet. Now there are many ways you can begin recording your macro. One way is to come up here and click on the View tab, go to the Macros group, click on the drop-down arrow, and there it is, Record. Or if you have the Developer tab up, just go to the Code group, and there it is, Record. And as you recall, if you don't have the Developer tab up, just right-click on the ribbon, go down to Customize the ribbon, and check Developer, and it will pull. Or you can come down here and customize the status bar by right-clicking on it and checking Macro Recording. Now it says recording, but it's not. It says it's not recording, but that adds the icon down below here to the status bar that when I hover over it, you can see it says no macros are currently recording. Click to begin recording a new macro. Okay. And because you may be recording more than one macro, it's a good idea to give it a name. In fact, you can't record it without giving it a name. You can leave it as a generic name, but that's not going to tell me what this macro does. So what I'm doing is I'm going to be formatting a bunch of titles on my worksheets here. So let's keep it simple and say format underscore titles. Now I added the underscore to separate the two words because the macro name does not like spaces or other characters. So if it doesn't like it, you'll know when you click on the OK button that it will pull up and it'll give you some error that doesn't tell you that it doesn't like the name. But trust me, you want to go back and redo the name so it doesn't have any special characters in it. At least we're safe with the underscore character, and or you can just slam it all together, but my eye takes a little bit of time to see where one word stops and the other word begins, so I'm going to go ahead and add the underscore. Then the shortcut key, we can use M. I don't want to use P because that's for print, that's already being used. Or if Control M is already being used and I still want to use the letter M, we can add an additional key, like holding down Shift key and hitting the letter M, and so we have to use the combination that allows me to still use M, but using also the Shift key, so it's Control Shift M. Where do you want to store the macro? Is it going to be in this workbook? A new workbook? If you select that and click OK, it'll open up a new workbook for you to store the macro in. I don't want to do that. Then you have the Personal Macro Workbook. Now this Personal Macro Workbook is a hidden workbook. In other words, when you open up Excel, it's going to have this macro copied over into it that's going to be hidden that allows you to go ahead and use that macro in any workbook that you have open. It's like having an invisible servant there that when you hold out your hand, he gives you a glass of water. In this case, he's going to give you a macro, and that's in any workbook because that hidden workbook is going to be there available to quickly give you the macro. It's not going to give it to you. It's going to be showing in your workbook, but it can only be shown when it's linked to the Personal Macro Workbook that's being hidden. We'll go over that a little bit more later on. So to keep it simple, let's do this workbook. And then you can be a bit descriptive if that helps you and say, okay, the formats we're applying is going to be magenta, the font is Comic Sans, the size is 50. Let's just say applying formats to titles of worksheets. That's it. Click Okie dokie and it's recording. Now, it's not recording time, so take all the time you want. It's just recording steps. Now, notice that when I started recording, I already had the title here selected. And that's important because if I had a selection down here, and then I said, oh, I want this cell to be formatted, and I jumped up here, it will record me moving from this cell. Well, not where I'm moving from, but where I'm moving to. And so when I execute that macro, it'll actually move to cell A1 of any worksheet. So keep that in mind. And what I wanted to do is I didn't want to have it recording me moving from one cell to the next, so I just started with already having the cell selected. Then I can just come up here, click on the Home tab, go to the font group, and apply my formats like the color red. Let's go ahead and change the size and go to 20, and then change the font type to Monotype Corsiva, hit enter. Ooh, that looks fancy. And then when I'm done, come down here, and notice how that icon has changed to a square. When you hover over it, it says that a macro is currently recording. Go ahead and click on it to stop, or if you come up here on the Developer tab, the icon has changed there from recording to stop. Click on that and it stops it. And then if you want to view the macro, on the Developer tab, you can click on Macros. It brings up the macro window, or close out. You can go to the View tab, click on Macros, brings up the same window. Let's go ahead and click Cancel. And let's test to see if this works. Let's go to the next worksheet, select the title, and let's see what are the shortcut keys. Control Shift M. Sweet. Now, as I mentioned, you can also do it in a single click. If you watch my advanced filter training video and the macro that I used in there, I added a button into the worksheet. We're not going to be adding a button into the worksheet. We're going to be adding a macro button to the Quick Access toolbar. So to do that, you can right-click on it and customize it. Change it from popular commands to, there you go, macros. And it's got all the macros that I have recorded, just one. Double click on it, adds it over to the right, and that icon looks kind of awful. Let's go ahead and change it. With it selected, let's come down here and modify it and choose a symbol like a happy face, because we're always happy. And then for the display name, when you hover over the macro, you can go ahead and say something like, to format titles of worksheets, click OK, click OK. Hover over the happy face, there's the display to format titles of worksheets. Let's go to select A1, click on the happy dude. Awesome. Now, if we're done using it and we want to save our workbook, know that macros cannot be saved in your basic workbooks. What I mean by that is that when you create a new workbook, up here, you can see it on the title bar, it's got the extension XLSX. If you want to learn more about extensions, you can watch my Windows training video on extensions, but to keep it simple, the extensions tell the operating system what program is going to open up this file, and it's going to be Excel. And when I save this workbook, now that I have a macro in it, Excel is going to tell me that I have to change and save it to another type of file or file type. Let me show you. Click on Save, and it says these workbooks are going to be macro free. So if you go ahead and click Yes, we're going to delete the macro. I don't want to do that because I still want to use it. So if I go ahead and say no, it says, okay, you have to save it as another file type. And that other file type, when you click on the drop-down arrow, is going to be right there, Macro Enabled Workbook. Select it. You can see the extension, instead of XLSX, it's got the letter M for macro. So it'll still open up the Excel program, but as a workbook that will contain macros. Now, why did Microsoft do this? Because in earlier versions of Excel, you can save the macro in the same basic workbook. The reason why is because macros are a prevalent tool for transferring computer viruses. So Excel requires that all workbooks with macros be saved in the XLSM format to provide increased security. So with two different types of workbooks, if you receive one that's not macro enabled, well, you don't have to worry about macros infecting your computer as far as what Microsoft is telling us here. But if you receive a workbook that has this extension, then, make sure that you trust the person before you open it and execute a macro, because if there's a virus there, it could destroy your computer. In any case, it's saving it into my exercises folder. Let's just do the desktop here and click Save. Now, it gives me a prompt that says, be careful, parts of your document may include personal information that cannot be removed by the document inspector. So you know what might be a good idea before we save it? Let's click Cancel, and it says the document's not saved. Come up here and click on the File tab, and we covered this in an earlier training video. Info selected by default, come down here and check for issues, inspect the document, and of course it wants us to save it, and we get back to, when we say yes, that it has to be a macro-free enabled workbook. But what it does, if you watch that earlier training video, when it inspects it, it searches for hidden data and properties, and we can go ahead and remove it before we actually save it, because when we actually save it as a macro enabled workbook, then we have all that personal information eliminated, where it won't allow us to do that, as you saw in that pop-up, after it's saved as a macro enabled workbook. So let's go ahead and say no, and let's save it as the macro enabled workbook. Again, on the desktop, there it is, macro enabled. Click save. Again, we get the warning. That's fine. Click OK. And now it decides to go ahead and run it, so that's all right. I mean, as it said, it won't be able to remove maybe all of the hidden metadata or personal information, but you can still try. And it says it found this. Do you want to remove all? Click on it to remove all, and then go ahead and close out. And hopefully it removed the personal information that you don't want to be shared when you send this off to somebody else, if you send it off to somebody else. So we can go ahead and close out of here. If you want to save it, we can click save. Again, it's going to warn us about it. That's fine. Close out. It's on my desktop. And you can see that this icon, let me click and drag it over here. It's got that little page with the exclamation point, as opposed to opening up my exercises folder on the desktop. That doesn't have a little page with an exclamation point. So if you don't see your extensions to find out if that's a macro enabled workbook, because by default, the operating system is going to hide the extensions so you don't see the XLSM. So you want to look at the icons to make sure it doesn't have. Let me go ahead and change the icons to medium icons, and you can compare between the two there. There's the page with the exclamation point. So if you want to see the extensions and not have to look at the icon, or you just like the comfort of seeing your extensions like I do, again, watch my Windows training video on extensions, and I'll show you how you can not only view them, but how to be careful if you rename your file here that you don't delete or rename the extension. Now let's go ahead and open up the file that contains our macros, the macro enabled workbook. Double click on it, and you get the security warning that says macros have been disabled. Do you want to go ahead and enable it? Well, do you trust who sent this to you, or did you create the macros? Which, I mean, do you trust yourself? You can go ahead and click on enable. And if you want to change the warning there, where every time you open up a macro enabled workbook, you don't get that little message bar, you can come up here and click on the File tab, go down to Options, select Trust Center, come over here and select Trust Center Settings, and then come over here and select Macro Settings, and you get the options here. Disable everything with notification, or do you just not want to see it, not be bothered by it? Or disable all macros except those that are digitally signed, or enable all. They don't recommend that, because it could be dangerous if you get a workbook from somebody that you forgot that you had it enabled and you didn't mean to open it up without disabling it first, so you can actually look at the workbook without enabling a macro that may destroy the computer. Let's go ahead and click cancel and close out. Now let me right click on the Excel shortcut in the taskbar and open back up my Macro Basics workbook. And so we're back to where we started. The macro is not in this workbook because remember we did a save as, because we cannot save a macro in the basic workbook here. In fact, if you want to put me to the test, just go to the View tab, click on Macros. There's no macro there. Again, we did a save as. We saved it as another file type, so we still get our original without the macro in it. I know we got the happy face up here, but when you click on it, because there's no macro, it says, what are you doing? So he's not happy. Let's go ahead and right click on the happy face and remove him from the quick access toolbar. And let's do one more. And we'll keep it simple here. Let's select Arizona, click record, and we'll say format. I'm going to brush through this really quick because what I want to highlight, let me add also Shift M, is where we're storing the macro when it comes to a personal macro workbook. Select that, click Okie dokie, and then go ahead and click on the Home tab, and let's apply a few fonts and the size. That's enough right there. Click Stop, and then when I'm done I can go ahead and click Save. And when I click Save, notice that it doesn't give me a prompt saying, hey, wait a second, this is a macro-free workbook. You got to save it as a macro-enabled workbook. The reason being is because when you record your macro and you save it in the personal macro workbook, that's a hidden workbook that opens when you start Excel, and it makes the code available for you to go ahead, or it copies the code over to the workbook or workbooks that you have open. So if I come up here, click on the View tab, go to the Macros group, click on Macros, it's right there in this hidden workbook. So let me go ahead and click Cancel, go to the California tab, select California, and let's go ahead and do the shortcut keys, Control-Shift-M, and it works. Now this is a hidden workbook, so if I come up here on the View tab to the window group, I can select Unhide, and which workbook do I want unhidden? I'll select that, click Okie dokie, and there it is. This one contains the macro. And so anytime we open up Excel, this is going to open up. In fact, if I close out of here, and I can save it, and I close out of there, and I can save it, and I right-click on the icon and select Excel, and I open it up. Let me click on it again to restore it. It opens up the personal macro workbook. I'm like, why is it doing that? Because by default, it's supposed to be hidden. So it can open up a copy, a generic copy like Excel Workbook 1, Excel Workbook 2, depending upon how many times I want to open it up. So if I want this to go back into hiding so I don't see it, so I have to come back down here and right-click and open up a new workbook to get a generic one to be able to go ahead and do whatever I want. Then, let me close out. In the personal.xlsb workbook, again, the personal macro workbook, click on the View tab and say you want to hide it. So if I go ahead and close out and I save it and I right-click on the shortcut on the taskbar to open up the program again, you don't see the hidden workbook. If I come up here and click on the View tab, because the Unhide is an option that I can click on that allows me to go ahead and choose to open it up to view it. So if I don't want certain macros available in all the workbooks that I have open because the personal macro workbook is hidden and it provides me and feeds all the other open workbooks, then I would want to go ahead and unhide it and click Okie dokie. Go to the View tab, click on Macros, select the macros, and delete them. Now let's say I don't want to use this anymore. I don't want this hidden workbook when I open up my other workbooks. Deleting a macro or all the macros within it isn't going to stop it. It'll still pull up. Let's go ahead and click Cancel. The way to fix this so it doesn't pull up, let me go ahead and close out and don't save it, is to go ahead and click on the Start button, go to your computer, and I'll give you the address to get to this location where you can delete the startup file that every time you open up Excel, it opens up that hidden personal macro workbook. So it's going to be found on the C drive, double-click, find your users, double-click, and then the user login name that you use to log into your computer. This is going to be training. And then go ahead and open up App Data. Now, App Data is a folder that's hidden by default. And the only way to show hidden folders is when you're in the window here, hit the Alt key on the keyboard, and you can see the menu is up. Click on the Tools menu, go to Folder Options, click on the View tab, and go ahead to show hidden files, folders, and drives. You can watch my Windows training video on this because I go over it more in depth and some of the things you want to be careful about because there's a reason why it's hiding those files and folders and drives so you don't accidentally delete them. So if you stay on the path with where I'm going in this training video, you should be okay. In other words, don't delete anything as we go down the road here. So double click on the App Data folder to open it up. Go to Roaming, to Microsoft, find Excel, double click, and it's right there. Excel Start, double click, and there's that hidden workbook. Right click on it to delete it. Are you sure? Yes, it's gone. So when I close out, and I close out here, and I right click to open up Excel, it opens up, and when I click on the View tab, the Unhide is not an option that I can select because we deleted that personal macro workbook. That's going to open up every time we open up a workbook. So that's how you can go ahead and fix it and be done with it and not have it always open up. Mind you, if you have macros in it that you like, you just don't want it to open up in your workbook here, you just don't want it available in all the workbooks, there's something else you can do. You can actually copy your macros from one workbook to another. How do you do that? Well, let's go ahead and just save this as a macro-enabled workbook by clicking on the drop-down arrow and going to macro-enabled. And we'll do it to the desktop. There's the one that we saved earlier with just the one macro that we have in it. So we'll just call it this one the empty macro workbook and click Save. So how do you copy a macro from one workbook to another to copy it over here into the empty one? you have to have both workbooks open, the one that contains the macro that you wish to copy and the one that you want to copy it over to. So let's go ahead and minimize this down to the taskbar to be able to access the macro workbook on our desktop, or you don't have to minimize it, you can still restore it and click on the open folder or click file to open, to the computer to browse. Well, that's a lot of steps. And double click to open it up. And then what you can do is come up here and click on the View tab, go to the Macros group, click on Macros, and go ahead and click on Edit. Now, this does get into the next training video about editing your macro. We'll just keep it simple here, and then we'll go over it a little bit more in depth in the next training video. When I look over to the left-hand side, how many workbooks do I have open? Well, remember, I've got my empty macro, and then I have the actual workbook that contains the macro in it. And you can see that this one has a plus sign, that when you click on it to expand it, it shows you the folder, and it shows you the objects within that folder, and it doesn't have a module like this one down below does, the module, which is the macro. So to go ahead and to take this module, which contains the macro, and to put it over here in this workbook so it's available there, you can just go ahead and click and drag that and move it over there and just drop it right onto that folder, and there you go. That's it. Just click and drag the modules. It doesn't say macro, and that's fine. Then when you're done, come up here, click on the File menu, go down to Close and Return to Microsoft Excel. Let's go ahead and close out of the one that contains the macro. Again, the title, Macro Basic. Close out to the one that says Empty Macro. Let me type in some text here, and then select it, and Control-Shift-M. Hey, the macro's there. Let's come up here, click on the Macros button, and it's right there. Also, don't forget that you can run the macro from the macro window here. Select it and click on Run. I mean, in addition to running it from the shortcut keys or adding the button to the Quick Access toolbar. Thanks for watching. Hey, as a quick reminder, if you like my video, please give it a thumbs up. You can also click on me and subscribe to my channel to get notified of the latest videos. And for great specials on my products, please see the description below this video.